Great, good morning everyone. Hope you can all hear me. I'm Amanda Shepherd. I work for Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland, and I also chair the WPA Next Gen Committee. So it gives me great pleasure to be moderating this WPA webinar today, where our speakers will be giving a planning and market update, followed by a discussion by industry and local government leaders on the future of offices and retail in the West End. So welcome to you all. Thank you for joining on a Friday. By way of introductions, you'll be hearing an opening speech from Councillor Matthew Green, who is the Cabinet Member for Business and Planning at Westminster City Council. This will be followed by a presentation by James Norton, who's joining us from JLL. He's the Director of UK Research. And then this will lead us into a moderated panel discussion where I'm delighted to be joined by Deirdre Armsby, who's the Director of Place Shaping and Town Planning at Westminster City Council. We have Matthew Flood here with us, who's the Head of Occupier Markets at Landsec. We have Michelle McGrath here, who's an Executive Director at Capco. And last but by no means least, we have Charles Pinchbeck here, who's a Director of Capital Markets at JLL. So thank you to all of our speakers and panelists in advance. We should be set for a really topical and interesting discussion. But before we do get started, I'd just like to issue a reminder to the audience to submit any questions that you've got for the panel on Zoom using the chat function. And there'll also be 2 live polling questions for you to all engage with during that discussion, so please do participate when they pop up. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Westminster Cabinet Member Councillor Matthew Green to give his opening speech about the Council's priorities for planning and development. So Councillor Green, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to the WPA for allowing me to provide the introduction to this webinar on the future of offices and retail in the West End. Westminster City Council is proud to be the custodian of the West End. For many, the West End is London, and this is true not just symbolically, but also economically. In just 6 hectares, the West End generates £50 billion a year, which represents 3% of the entire country's annual economic output. It provides over 500,000 jobs, 30% of which are taken up by Westminster residents. And the West End provides the Exchequer with £17 billion per annum, including 8% of all business rates. The success of the West End is not just the success of London, but the success of the entire country. Which is why, as the West End's custodian, Westminster City Council is committed to overseeing its development, as well as to warding off any decline. You're welcome, Rishi. But we all know the scale of the challenge that the West End faces today. In the past few days, we've witnessed the collapse of Debenhams and Arcadia, which has put thousands of jobs at risk on Oxford Street alone. What we are seeing, at least in the case of Arcadia, is that the businesses that are least well adapted to 21st century retail are the most likely to fail. The need to adapt is nothing new. And while coronavirus didn't bring about this requirement for change, it accelerated it at a pace that no one could ever have expected. But this is not, by any means, the end of bricks and mortar retail. There will always be a need for high quality physical shopping experiences on our high street, including the nation's high street here in the West End. A Pitney Bowes global e-commerce study in 2018 showed that while we're shopping online more often, we're getting more and more frustrated with the experience. When making purchases for Christmas in particular, more than half of respondents felt let down by the online process, a 20% year-on-year increase. The survey also showed that online shoppers were incredibly unforgiving of online retailers' mistakes, with 1/4 of unsatisfied customers refusing to use that retailer's platform again. But West End retail will not thrive merely because the experience of online shopping is inferior. We have spent much of the last 6 months enduring this inferior experience and many other inferior experiences. And in spite of its drawbacks compared with in-person retail, many of us have now got used to shopping online. It's clear that we need to redefine what goes into our high streets. The customer is king, and we need to ask ourselves what draws him or her in. Not very long ago, it used to be boasted that you couldn't so much as get a cup of coffee on Regent Street. Because the businesses that are complementary to retail are as important, if not more important than retail itself, this simply has to change. I don't want people just to get a cup of coffee on Regent Street. I want them to get a meal, a cocktail, a haircut, a beauty treatment, a workout, even a vaccination, all while enjoying the world-class retail experience that the West End has to offer. We saw that when retail reopened after the first lockdown, footfall didn't really begin to recover until hospitality was able to open on the 4th of July. That's why the council's support for alfresco dining has been so important. And I'm pleased that this support is being extended until the end of April. Not only does it help to support the 80,000 jobs in Westminster's hospitality industry, it also indirectly supports the jobs in retail too. It also, as I'll come on to later, attracts returnees back to office-based work. Westminster's city plan has always been designed to embrace and enable the changes that are needed to renew and even revolutionise the West End. And with the changes to the use classes order and the introduction of Class E, this ambition is further endorsed and enhanced through the main modifications to the plan, which are currently out for consultation. The city plan favours a wide mix of commercial uses to support the West End's role as a retail, employment and cultural hub, as well as a centre for the visitor, evening and nighttime economies. The city plan also welcomes new office floor space, and as the JLL report will show, retail and hospitality will need offices as much as offices will need retail and hospitality. To attract employees back into an office environment, a vibrant retail, entertainment and food and beverage offer will be required. We also see the demand for green space growing among office returnees. The West End offers access not only to Hyde Park to its west, but also the amazing garden squares of Mayfair, Marylebone and Fitzrovia. We're in the process of seeing the planting of trees on Regent Street, with the temporary pavement extensions currently being built by the Crown Estate in cooperation with the council. And of course, greening will form a core part of our Oxford Street District programme. To support our vision for the West End, the City Council has also recently launched both a pop-up activation strategy for Westminster, as well as an international investment strategy. Working with landlords and our network of startups, we have the opportunity to use the empty units in our high streets as incubators for the next generation of retail entrepreneurs. And maybe the loss of high street names will be more palatable if we can encourage Korean concept stores or technology-led shopping experiences like Nike's House of Innovation to replace them. The council is also lobbying the government to level the playing field between online retailers and those on the high street. In our response to the business rates consultation, we have called for a comprehensive online sales tax to replace the current business rate system. This would generate a similar amount of revenue for the Exchequer, but would mean that bricks and mortar businesses would no longer be unfairly saddled with an inequitable share of the tax burden. The past few months have been hard, but the approval of the first of the coronavirus vaccines has transformed hardship into hopefulness. I don't think I would have been saying this even a month ago, but I'm excited for what 2021 brings for the West End. I'm confident that working with our partners, the developers, the landowners, the bids and the businesses, we will deliver a transformed, tractable and on-trend West End that will be welcoming residents and visitors for many years to come.
Great, Councillor Green, thank you so much for that introduction. I think that's really set the scene for us in terms of Westminster's ambitions for supporting the future of the West End. So to follow on from that, I'm now going to hand over to James Norton, who's going to present a summary of the recently published research, try saying that after a glass of wine, on the future of the office demand in central London after COVID-19. So James, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to the WPA for inviting me here today to speak. I'm just going to share my screen. Always a slight nervous moment here to make sure you can all see that. Slightly delay there. Apologies. So on strict instructions here, not to exceed 7 minutes. So this will be very much a whistle-stop tour of a fairly extensive report, but we will share the link if you wanted to read more following the presentation. I'll start with a few minutes on the market context, but I'd like to focus most of my time today talking about the future. I think that's the most interesting subject, and hopefully that'll provide some interesting talking points for our panel. So with that, if we cast our minds back to the start of 2020, London entered this crisis actually in relatively good shape from an investor and developer perspective. We were in an extended period of above average leasing activity. The level of speculative development was relatively contained relative to the entry point to previous recessions, and vacancy rates in the West End were average. In the city, they were actually below average. On the investment side, London had been the most traded city globally for 7 out of the past 10 years. And at the start of the year, we were actually in the midst of a boost in post-election activity in both markets, in investment and in leasing. Fast forward to today's market, it won't come as a surprise to anyone on today's call that leasing activity has been subdued. We're around 50% down on 10-year average levels, and my expectation is that 2020 will be a record low for leasing volumes. The level of under offers has steadily trended down during this period of great uncertainty. That's had an impact on vacancy rates, as you might expect. The West End has now risen to 5.9%, ahead of average and the highest level since 2010. A similar picture in the investment market, with COVID putting a halt, obviously, on physical viewings and also on visitors from overseas. So year-to-date volumes are significantly down as well on 10-year average levels. Albeit we do expect an uptick in the final quarter. We have seen a recent increase in the level of under offers and also the level of stock available to transact. So that's really to set the scene. I think COVID obviously has forced us into the largest ever home working experiment. And the reason we're having this debate is because to some extent it has been a success. It does pose a question which is we're debating in the property industry, but beyond in mainstream media as well. What is the role of the office, and indeed, do we need an office? So against that backdrop, I'll start and look at the research. So there are 6 key factors that JLL have identified that we feel will shape the future of office demand. And I think worth noting that some of these trends were already emerging prior to COVID, but we do expect some will now be accelerated post-COVID. So they are remote working, office density, office design, technology, local amenities and green spaces, and commuting patterns. I don't have time to cover all of these in detail, but I'll touch on some of the key headlines, focusing mostly on remote working and local amenities. So starting with that trend towards remote working, a survey done by JLL of 160 corporate real estate leaders shows an expectation that some of the virtual meetings and an expansion of remote working will continue post-COVID, with over 75% in both cases thinking that will be the case. And interestingly, only 10% believing we're going to go back to how we were prior to COVID. If we look at a survey of employees, and I should add this is skewed towards younger employees, so I expect slightly different results if we expanded that to a wider group. The top graph shows the level of working from home pre-COVID, and the bottom shows how that would change and the aspiration to work from home post-COVID. And you can see a clear shift towards an increasing number of remote days, albeit I think interestingly, the number of people who want to work from home full-time is unchanged. So how does that narrative look from companies? Well, the public response from major occupiers of office space has changed markedly, actually during the COVID period. If you go back to the spring, we had some harsh words from companies such as Barclays and Morgan Stanley, reporting that their employees could easily work from home. They needed much less real estate, and essentially hinting that the office as we know it is dead. That narrative has changed to a much more nuanced view more recently. Goldman Sachs, Google and Facebook emphasising actually the importance of the physical office and how that's really emphasised during this period when we've all been outside of the office. So what does all that mean for real estate portfolios? Well, a couple of findings here from the same survey I referred to earlier. Longer term, most are expecting a steady rationalisation or moderate impact on our portfolio. I think the 11% at the top there for a massive and accelerated rationalisation can't be ignored. But based on these results, we're not going to see a major reduction in demand for office space across the board anytime soon. One theme that did come out very clearly in this survey was the trends or a flight to quality, something we've been seeing pre-COVID. And actually, if you look at the graph on the left, it shows most expecting an increase in higher quality spaces. And on the flip side, on the right-hand side, most expecting a decrease in lower quality spaces. Obviously, the flight to quality extends beyond just the building characteristics to the building's location. And we've highlighted here some of the factors which combined will help submarkets to recover more quickly post-COVID. So places with resilient food and drink offer, wider pavements and cycle lanes, campus environments where you can control the environment and curate the spaces. And I think in the short term, at least, low and medium rise buildings will benefit for obvious reasons and social distancing. And of course, as I was alluded to earlier, the importance of green spaces come into question. And I think employees will increasingly seek green spaces near their offices, more so than in the past. And the commuter pattern may well change. If people can work remotely more often, they may accept a longer commute. And as a result, being near a overground transport node becomes much more important. So on my final two slides, what does this mean for London? Well, we think a London headquarters becomes more important, not less, but much more focus on the quality of that space and the location of that space. That may be complemented by hubs outside of London, particularly around the M25, but that space is more likely to be in flexible spaces rather than on a traditional lease. And in many locations, we feel landlords will need to be much more operational and run offices more like hotels, and then going forward. So to summarise, and on my final slide here, this is our timeline for the impacts. I won't read everything out here, it's quite text heavy, but really at the moment, a lot of decisions are being made as a result of the recession. So yeah, and trying to meet COVID protocols. But as we go into next year, optimism will be increasing, and we'll start to need the office to be able to dial up and dial down depending on the rate of infection and restrictions. Next year, the kind of real impact of the recession will start to hit. So things might start feeling worse before they get better. But a new wave of value-add opportunities will emerge, we feel, as investors prepare for a post-COVID world. That will bring polarization between high quality and the rest. And longer term into 2022, we feel the commuter pool will really start to bed in. And that polarization I talked about between higher quality and lower quality offices will also become more flexible. And just as a final point, I think the interesting thing to watch here will be which markets in London will recover first and see the strongest level of activity, all to do, I think, with the geographical influences that I mentioned earlier. So hopefully that's within time. And thank you very much for your time. I'll pass back to Amanda and the panel.
Great, perfectly timed, James. Thank you. And thanks again for sharing those insights. I'm sure many of us can relate to a lot of those themes coming out, given our own personal experiences over the last 9 months or so. So I think your presentation of the future office piece is a really great springboard for us to kickstart our discussion. But clearly, the future prosperity of the West End has far more angles to it than just offices. And I think Councillor Green touched on a number of those. So to now move the discussion more towards the West End market post-COVID and some of those policy levers that we might need to support that evolution, I'd like to welcome Deirdre, Michelle, Matthew and Charles to the conversation. It's lovely to have you all. So perhaps, Michelle, if we can start off with you. We know that the West End global status does go far beyond the sort of traditional business district of offices. How important is it to have a mix of uses to ensure the success of areas like Covent Garden, for example? And as a bit of a follow-on to that, how do you think that landlords and policymakers specifically can support that longer-term resilience of these businesses after what's been, I think we can all agree, a very challenging year for us?
Thank you, Amanda, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here today. It was really interesting listening to both James and Matthew, and I think they covered a lot of the key points well. I mean, look, for us, we have always maintained and continue to maintain that London is a world-class global city. We don't think that's going to change. It's a fantastic place to live. It's a brilliant place to work. It's one of the most dynamic cities in terms of the quality of its retail, its restaurants, its bars, its leisure offers, its culture, its arts. It's right up there, and it all comes with this incredible history and heritage, which is very, very hard to replicate. I'm sure there are exceptions to this, but the rule of law is also incredibly strong. So when you take all of that and you combine it together, it really is one of the leading cities. And I think there's not many cities out there that can truly compete with London. And I'm probably a little bit biased there. I think, look, your comments around retail mixed use, we think the key thing here is it's incredibly important to make sure that the components that make London great, you know, those things that I talked about, it is an economic powerhouse because of all of those reasons. It's really important that we focus and we enhance those drivers that make this such a fantastic city. And I think the quality of the offices, the retail, the restaurants, all of that feeds into it. I think the key thing is really flexibility. And it's become a bit of a buzzword in recent months. But it's flexibility in everything. It's in our own thinking, challenging ourselves, you know, as asset owners, as landowners, challenging ourselves. Are we doing things the right way? Can we do them better? But also looking at, you know, policies that are flexible enough in their approach to enable us to respond to market demand effectively and quickly, and also consumer demand. And that's really important, because going back to some of the themes that your other panelists have covered, you know, one of the key themes going into COVID, as Matthew rightly said, is quality and experience. And, you know, they've just become more accelerated and more important, but they are very, very important drivers of some of the changes in consumer habits that we've seen. And I think it's really important that we focus on that. And how do we create really fantastic places, introduce world-class retail, world-class amenities, and also use our city better. And that's really important. So just to give you some proof points on that, you know, when we went through the first lockdown, the flexibility and the, I think the speed of the collaboration between landowners and Westminster to bring forward a very broad West End pedestrianisation plan was incredible. And it showed actually when you have the will, the talent and the policies, you can make things happen. And not only can you do that, but you can make a difference. And it did make a difference, you know, for somewhere like Covent Garden and also some of the other fantastic landowners not far from us. They were able to pivot their offers. It meant there was more outside seating, there was a better alfresco offer, more people came to visit, it felt safer, it was just an overall better environment. And that's really important, and that shows that actually those policies can make a difference, they do make a difference, and economically they can really make a change.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice point for us to bring Deirdre into that piece, you know, to pick up, Michelle, on some of your points, especially around the importance of flexibility and adaptability of our places. You know, how, Deirdre, do you see Westminster City Council looking to use its sort of planning policy and placemaking levers to actually encourage that vibrant and mixed use approach that everybody is telling us that we need? Deirdre, just to start, you think you're on mute?
Sorry about that.
Right.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Great to be here and be part of this very inspiring conversation so far. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, as Councillor Green has laid out and Michelle has touched on too, you know, this concept of collaborating with all the actors in, you know, the built environment is really, really crucial, I think, for us to shift our way into the future and to remain a very relevant and contemporary part of London, if not the best part of it. We have, I suppose, had some practice in that idea of flexibility over very recent years, because as the others have also demonstrated, you know, many of the trends that we've seen writ large in the last 9 months were on their way prior to that, you know, in particular in and around the Oxford Street district, and some of the tensions with, you know, trying to increase the green footprint of the built environment in the borough. You know, it was happening, but all happening at a slower pace probably than we needed. So I think this has shone a light on, you know, what are those great parts of our city. And I think key to me is, you know, there's so much uniqueness to this part of London, and that is absolutely what will take us through to maintain in all the things we do, be it changes in use, changes in function, making sure that we, you know, curate and look after those the rich sort of hyper mixed use environment that we've got, and probably intensify that so that we end up with that sort of people orientated city where it's more comfortable to walk and cycle around. You've got your access to green space, you can work in an office that accommodates your well-being and lets you do the best you can do. So we very much had started to be in some of that space, and there's a number of decisions I guess we've made over the last few years that bear witness to that. And then moving forward, you know, we have this absolutely amazingly timely, you know, opportunity now with a new city plan that has, you know, swept up the recent changes from Class E and that inbuilt flexibility that's definitely the bedrock of the spirit of that legislation. And both, you know, the spirit and the letter of it is something that we welcome, to give us some levers and take us away from some of the things that appeared more intransigent in quite a broad and old policy framework in many ways. So we're now on the cusp of us having a city plan that is much more flexible and permissive, I think, to a broad range of bringing the city up to date. But we've also got to a position, I guess, where there is a bigger focus on partners and the actors in the field. Because, for example, with Class E, what that actually means is probably lots of the landowners have a possibly bigger role in the use pattern that we see rolled out, because they no longer require planning permission. So they get the chance to bring that patchwork together, and hopefully they'll do that in that mixed use fashion. And we still retain, because of this high value historic environment, which in itself is hugely economically beneficial in terms of visitor numbers and just some of the indications of the setting that people want to live and work in. But landowners perhaps have a sort of a raised role in that, and we've all got to combine, because they'll still perhaps come to us for the, you know, physical configuration of those spaces, and maybe rely on us in our more proactive place shaping work to provide more and more enhanced and contemporary settings for them to carry out their business and investments.
Yeah, I think that's a really poignant point, Deirdre, actually. And so do you feel that the national planning reforms are actually helping towards that goal, or potentially hindering efforts in other ways of this sort of hyper mixed use creation?
Yeah, I mean, I think on the hyper mixed use sort of propositions, I think it's got all the pillars in there for us to, you know, make that cake in the way that suits the West End. I think probably some of the more rigid, you know, opportunities such as, you know, domestic permitted development, they're not such an issue for the West End. You know, it is different parts of the changes to the regime that have already been put in place, such as Class E, that are more beneficial to the West End. So that's quite a good place to be in. I think there's more to come. You know, the overarching response to that package of reforms is yet to emerge, and indications are it might take another 2 or 3 years for that to come through. But one of the things that I think will come through this year that will be quite influential is new national planning policy. I think that will absolutely encourage more flexibility. It will encourage greener developments. and it will therefore, in those aspects, be good for the West End. And so I think some of the more hindering parts of it may not be as applicable to this geography as you know, you might have thought just looking at the whole range of it at the outset, really.
Great. And actually, if we can pivot the conversation slightly back towards offices again, we've talked about sort of the retail and the mixed use piece on that, but Matt, if we can potentially take your views on this initially, and I think James had actually touched on this earlier in his presentation. There are arguments to say that the sort of physical space of the office is dead. It all sounds quite dramatic, but obviously lockdown has shown us that people can work perfectly well from home. You know, in your view, do you get the same sense that the office might be more redundant, or actually do you think there's better ways for Westminster's workplaces to evolve and actually still remain competitive and attractive in this backdrop?
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I think it's a fascinating time to be working in the sector, and I think I would echo a lot of what James and the JLL report says, which I think is, for anybody on the call, it's certainly worth a read. I think it's a great piece of research which tries to capture a lot of the trends that we're grappling with. You know, as James said, I think certainly at the start of the first lockdown, there was a lot of noise around the death of the office and this kind of existential threat to the workplace and what it stood for. And I think thankfully that has become more balanced in recent months as people realised it was a forced experiment, and actually there were limitations as well as there being some positives to take from it. I think we have to be really cognizant that this is, though, permanent disruption to the office world. I think it'd be naive to think that a vaccine will suddenly mean we all immediately revert to previous behaviours. I think something that certainly over this length of time will create embedded shifts in how people treat their office space and what role they see that playing. And I think that means we can't be complacent. I think this is a really interesting call to look at those comparisons between retail and the office world. I think, you know, almost in our business, we've been grappling with that, the threat of online and what does that mean for the physical store. And you can certainly see comparisons there between the flexible working movement and what does that mean for the role of the physical office. And I think, you know, as James rightly said, I feel a hybrid model is probably emerging as the consensus, and the future will be one where you've got this ecosystem of physical spaces, digital spaces, but the central office will remain a core pillar, and I'm very confident of that. But I think we will have to evolve. I think we'll have to recognise that shift and embrace it, and really look at the places we're creating, the business models we're operating, and how can we respond to that customer and consumer data that's coming through to make sure that we can stay relevant. I think just stepping out to the West End, I think the role of the office will become far more around social interactions, whether that's within businesses and their own talent, or whether that's engaging with clients and the business development side. And I think that's only going to create a stronger competitive advantage for the West End and cement its status. You know, if people are going to go to the trouble of travelling into these central hubs, they're going to want to experience amenities, culture, vibrancy, all the things that Matthew and others have mentioned already. So I think that's only going to play to the strengths of the West End. And as I say, you know, an HQ in those kind of destinations will only become more important. But as I say, we have to stay alive to these accelerating trends, make sure we're adapting, and therefore we're continuing to deliver those aspirational spaces, which are potentially no longer an obligation. And I think that's a key change in consumer behaviour.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We've also just got a poll up as well for the audience to participate in what they sort of see some of the key trends in returning to the office. Have you got any sort of thoughts about the integration of wellness or structural changes within the actual physical office itself at the moment, or is it pretty much just going to be self-moderating as people return and tell what their preferences are when they get there?
No, I think it comes back to potentially the role of the landlord and developer is changing. People are looking to us to help lead and inform and share what could be best practice and what the art of the possible is in these physical spaces. So, you know, all the themes that are on screen there are very, very relevant. Wellbeing will be critical, and that's from a basic level of we want a healthy and safe space, which we feel confident to come to. But then also, how can we look after the more mental health aspects and physical fitness through the kind of amenities and programs of events that you can hold now. But yeah, we're looking at all our designs at the moment and saying, how can we ensure we tailor those and are alive to the changes? As I say, it's a case of not being complacent and thinking we can just revert back to what we've always done, but using this as a catalyst for really improving our offer and our products and how we partner with customers. And I think partnership is really what underpins all of this. It's our partnerships with our customers and how they use our buildings, our partnerships with the local authorities in ensuring that the planning frameworks allow us to deliver the right spaces which continue to allow the West End to be the powerhouse that it is today.
Yeah, and Michelle, I think you also touched on elements of that as well, about this partnership piece, especially even within retail, but it seems as though it's a more holistic approach across offices and retail, and there perhaps might not be that same distinction. That partnership will spread across all facets of the real estate industry.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really will. I think, you know, Deirdre touched on it. I think collaboration will be hugely important. We've seen some changes in planning that, as Deirdre suggested, will allow people more flexibility, but you really have to do these things against a place shaping strategy, and make sure that it all works for, you know, and I'm speaking here, you know, we tend to be estate owners, but, you know, even for those that only own a few assets, it's got to fit in with the overall fabric of the place and the direction that you wish it to head.
Fantastic. And it also seems our audience are in agreement. 74% of them agree that more collaboration and amenity spaces will be filtering through into the office environment. So really interesting to see that. I'm conscious of leaving enough time for us to take questions from the audience. So perhaps as a few final points for discussion, Charles, let's bring you in here. So despite this kind of public sector confidence in the West End and the support that Westminster City Council is giving, do you think that central London still actually faces greater threat, perhaps from more convenient high streets and out of town, out of London and other UK cities? And is that a challenge that you're experiencing, and how might we look to deal with that?
Thank you, Amanda. It's good to have the opportunity to take part in this. I think in the briefing we had, one of the words used was existential. You know, have things changed so fundamentally that the West End is, you know, we're never going to come back into the West End. And I think there's no doubt that during lockdown our habits have really changed. We are staying more local. You know, if we go out, it's in our own neighbourhood. We're not going into town. I've had 2 meals out since March, and they're both within 10 minutes of the house. So I think that's what we've done. And we've seen businesses sort of innovating and restructuring to where they are expanding. It is where they've got that local residential catchment, which of course is the polar opposite of what there is in the West End. And then of course, if we're working at home, we're not meeting people for lunch, we're not doing shopping, we're not staying on and going to the theatre or galleries you know, after work. There's no doubt that the West End has been really, really hard hit. And I think when you lay on top of that the virtual collapse of international travel, the West End has probably been hit harder than anywhere else, probably in the UK and possibly in the world. You know, it's one of the sort of less welcome distinctions of being a global city. But I think, you know, is that existential? Is that fundamental? Is that long term? And I think if you look at the underlying national and international trends, I think not. I think people as individuals may well fly less, but the growth of the global middle class means there'll be more people wanting to visit exceptional places, and London has to be right up there as a place in the world that everybody wants to go. And just my own experience, you know, the changes in working pattern, we are going in less frequently, will be, but I think when we do, it's more of an occasion, it's more of an event, and we want to pack more into our days, and we're going in to meet people and interact. So I think whilst individually we may be going in less, I think it could be more intensive. And I think a day in the office where you're just in the office will feel wasted in the future. You know, that was a day I've not made the most of. So I think, yeah, undoubtedly the West End does face challenges, and I think it's been hit harder, and I think it will take longer to recover, mainly because of the travel aspect. I mean, you know, we found as a firm, you know, elsewhere in Germany, we're virtually full occupancy within our own offices because a lot of people drive in. You know, you're not exposed to the anxiety of using high density public transport. But I think it will recover. I think it will take longer, but when it does, I think it will be as strong as ever. And I think the challenge for us all is to make sure it not only survives, but it adapts to be right up there when it does come back.
And just on that point of adaptability, Charles, we kind of talk about conceptually how people will be interacting with offices and places, but in terms of the actual kind of physical boundaries of how our buildings will need to adapt themselves, have you got any insights about how we could repurpose perhaps secondary office stock to bring it up to that level of quality that will mean that people want to start coming back in? And Matt, also potentially one for you to chip in on this one as well. I think James had raised this point around really needing to drive the quality to make sure that when people do come in, their time is really counting.
Yeah, I perhaps see it less as repurposing as perhaps recycling. I think one of the changes with the sort of more contemporary office fit out is, when I was a boy, if you couldn't do 2.7 clear and 4 meters overall, you just pulled it down. But actually, because wireless technology means you don't need the floor void, we now love to see the exposed air conditioning, so we haven't got to put metal tiles and things in. So that actually means now most buildings can be adapted to provide a contemporary office environment. I'm very pleased to see Matthew nodding as I'm talking, so that's encouraging. So actually, what I see is probably earlier obsolescence, and which I think in many ways is a good thing, because actually what we want as occupiers, as human beings from our office, and then the way we want them to perform in terms of sustainability has changed quite fundamentally. But I think this time, this change is something that can be adapted within literally within existing structures. So actually, I see it that process being something that's accelerated, which in many ways I think is only a good thing, because it's producing the offices that people want to come into and doing it in a way which is so much more sustainable.
Matt, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that that final point there is the key, and it's around the sustainability trend. And I think the impact of COVID, or one of them, will certainly be to just continue reinforce that wider societal awakening around the climate emergency. And I think as people see it very much hand in hand with their own personal well-being and wider societal sustainability goals, it's just going to drive that. And I think, as someone said, the greenest building you've got is the one that's already there. So if you can recycle buildings and repurpose them, then that's a fantastic starting point in terms of the embodied carbon that could be saved by pursuing that route and being more creative. And the West End, you've clearly got this fantastic fabric of historical buildings that can be repurposed. So there's certainly a flight to quality. So they will need that capital investing in them to make sure they can meet those contemporary needs. But certainly, we should all be starting with a recycling mindset.
Yeah, and on that topic really of net zero carbon, Deirdre, how are you seeing developers' presentation for net zero carbon integrating into their development plans? And for Westminster, how is that being balanced against other important priorities, such as delivering the affordable housing and heritage protection? Sorry, Deirdre, once again, I'll mute.
That you don't hear what's going on in my house. So yeah, I mean, obviously there are some tensions in there. I think we'd all be a bit naive to say there isn't. However, I think, it's a massive priority of the leadership of the council and all of us. And I mean, the principles of sustainability in terms of development have been in planning policies and regulations for many years, and building control too. Perhaps now the shift is that they are much more up there in those sort of very important issues for us to consider. So it's not a sequenced approach where a policy objective is fulfilled before you would look at sustainability. It's about very early engagement to make sure that those very key issues, and undoubtedly affordable housing absolutely is, that sustainability is right up there with it, and that the earlier everybody understand what the important outcomes of particular developments are, and that there's some equity between those issues, we believe that all those things can come to fruition, because we're certainly not going to do one first and then have a look and see what we can fit in of the other. I think they've definitely got to go hand in hand, and if you like, with our theme of partnership. And we will address them full on, in very early discussions around developments. And there may have to be some trade-offs with these things as we move along, but I think as you know, the costs and viability of, you know, those greener buildings, because it's been embraced by landowners much more comprehensively, you know, that makes it less of a rarefied and expensive thing to do, and hopefully we can get to some good equilibrium where, you know, those very important features are brought forward in development. Because as we've just said, you know, our hyper mixed use city that's more and more people orientated actually requires all of these things to be dealt with, you know, at scale, to provide that quality and reinforce the USP of the West End.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, on time, I'm going to open up the floor to some questions. We've had one come in for Councillor Green, hoping that he'll be able to chip in to answer this one. But the question is that Oxford Street is, of course, undergoing a huge amount of change now as a result of the pandemic. But more longer term, what do you think is your vision for the nation's high street, and what can we expect that to look like in, say, 2030?
First of all, I can tell you that we just recently launched our new Oxford Street District website. So if you go to osd.london, you can see a lot of what we're planning for the Oxford Street District there. I think that what we want to see from 2030 is a lot of what we've been talking about today. So the Oxford Street of the future needs to have that focus on quality. It needs to have that focus on hyper mixed use. It needs to have that focus on the customer. It needs to, you know, our agenda for Oxford Street is, one, to make it greener, one, to make, as you saw in the JLL proposal, we really want to tick all those boxes of what's going to bring people back into central London. They want those green spaces, they want the widened pavements, they want the access to the high quality retail and the fantastic food and beverage offer. And of course, you know, Westminster has that fantastic food and beverage offer. Unlike Charles, I've been out for meals many more than 2 times. When it comes to supporting Westminster's business, I very much put my mouth where their money is. Sorry, I've gone off track again. But I think that what we absolutely need to do is to the attention span of customers has grown much shorter, and one of the appeals of the of internet shopping is how nimble and how changeable it is. So we need to make sure that the physical shopping experience has that same level of responsiveness. So we want to. I think we'll see. You'll probably see many fewer traditional high street stores or high street department stores. You'll see many more kind of concept stores which will have an interactive element. You'll see more pop-ups, more cooperation, more smaller businesses working together to offer an experience. I think it will be the retail of the future will be one that will be very immersive. And that's what we want to achieve for Oxford Street, not just in 2030, but hopefully as early as 2021.
Fantastic. And Michelle, is that a similar type of theme to what you'd be adapting and approaching for Covent Garden, for example, through Capco?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, look, it's all about creating world-class experiences. We've always thought that at Capco. That's been the simple vision for Covent Garden since Capco took over the estate. I think you have to be flexible, you have to be nimble, you have to be targeted, and you have to be really savvy when it comes to the consumer and how they want to spend their time and their money. They are far more discerning. Our personal view is that people will do less, but they will do better. So very much that focus on quality, which I mentioned earlier, which I also think Matthew touched on. So I think you need the ability to pivot your retail strategies. You'd be really clear on what the differences are between relevant, multi-channel, digitally focused, world-class retail is, alongside fantastic F&B, which I think, you know, we mustn't forget here that people don't just come in to shop. They come in to do lots of things, and eating is, I think, as everyone has commented on eating in a restaurant, it's a really important pastime. It's something that people like to do. So I think absolutely you need a really strong approach to all of those uses, but fundamentally it needs to be focused on what's relevant and what's high quality.
And perhaps an unfair question, but do you have any examples of places, you know, internationally that seem to be doing this really well at the moment that we can either take learnings from or take inspiration from?
It's a great question. I think at the moment, at this current juncture, there are a lot of global cities are actually struggling with the same issues that we are. But I think you look across the globe, you look at the Marais in Paris, you know, compare that to where it was 15 years ago. It's an incredibly bustling, full of bars, full of life, fantastic retail, fantastic restaurants. It's a great example of how you can create a really high quality environment with heritage. You know, you don't have to start from scratch. This is, you know, to Matthew's point, there's a lot of recycling, curation and place shaping, strategic thought that has gone into that. But also other, perhaps newer cities, you know, there are things that we can learn from Shanghai. There are things that we can learn from Seoul. Why not? Some of those are incredibly tech forward, smart cities. And I think a lot of those learnings could be integrated into the West End. Yeah.
I would completely agree with that. And I think actually that what we haven't really spoke about is the role of digital within this. Obviously, we're talking about the very sort of physical environment, but to open it up to the panel really, have you got any views about how digital will need to align with a more physical environment for people to get the most out of both aspects? Who's brave enough to take that one? Deirdre.
Sorry, we are doing some, you know, really innovative and pioneering work around, I guess, that it sounds a bit odd, but the sort of traditional smart city interventions that have been rolled out, you know, to great effect in many cities in the world, including Singapore, I think being probably the top example of it. But also, I think it's about, again, about flexibility and adaptation. And of course, technology, digital connectivity is in and of itself something that changes practically every day. So, you know, we need to have, you know, a good, solid, adaptable, flexible digital infrastructure offer. And that's sort of what we're working on now, both in terms of how it connects buildings, what goes on inside them, you know, the rollout of broadband, and, you know, Westminster's moved from being very low down national league tables on that to being number 2. And, you know, so we've done a huge amount of work to bring it up to speed, but now we want to bring it beyond that and take it into new territories. And I think, you know, there's some very specific examples about how digital can be used to get people to walk around the West End, and, you know, to do the shop, do the food and drink, go to the gallery, you know, link all those things together through apps. And there's some of those available at the moment, but I don't think it's not business as usual for everyone who lands in the West End to go to work for the day and then to know through digital cues, you know, what they then can do in the evening. And we've all discuss this, that within buildings and outside of buildings, you know, this idea of experiences is very much what we need to enhance as we go forward, because we have this an amazing backdrop through our historic environment, and we need to use the digital opportunities, and as I say, they change every day, to get us there. And I think the other part of that is the connectivity through to all the transport that we have available. And I think things like, you know, simple things like, you know, bus usage has been massively improved by the fact that there's a digital screen at a bus stop that tells you it's coming in 3 minutes. And, you know, we may merge into, you know, electric vehicles and how you can hail those if, you know, the autonomous ones come our way, and so on and so forth. So I think, yeah, there's lots of exciting things going to happen in that field.
And Matt, have you got any insight into that, especially from a sort of office perspective?
Yeah, I think there's kind of two layers to it from a digital perspective. There's an operational aspect, which is, how can a building infrastructure, as Deirdre said, be smart, be sophisticated, help with energy management, etc. And I think that's just become like a utility and a hygiene factor for modern workplaces. And then there's the experiential layer, and that's how can you blur the physical and digital spaces to enhance someone's experience. And I think that's what we've got to really focus on, rather than just technology for technology's sake. It's how's it really improving how someone experiences those spaces or navigates those spaces. And I think that's the key to focus on. And I think interesting one for us in the West End, where Piccadilly Lights is one of our jewels. And so we're looking there, how can you create this connection between the mobile world and the physical world, so have interactions between where you are and your mobile device, because we do so much on these mobiles, but people want that seamless experience and want that blurring. So I think there's some really exciting technologies coming through which can help at a city level really help you engage with your surroundings and get more out of it.
And what do you think in terms of either policy or infrastructure might be required to really push that agenda forward if it's not already in place?
From a policy perspective, I suppose, it's just ensuring that the infrastructure is there to support this additional usage at a very basic level. In terms of that connectivity, it's far more visible than it was. So, office occupiers will look for a wired score certificate, for example, which shows them how strong is the connectivity, how resilient is the infrastructure from a digital perspective at that building. So it's now something which is far more transparent, and the bar keeps rising. So it's just ensuring that, I say that common infrastructure in the district can support those enhanced users, because that's key to our competitive advantage.
Fantastic. Just to call to the audience, do we have any more questions for the panel? I'm conscious we have a couple of minutes left, but in the absence of that, any sort of final thoughts from anyone that they just wish to share with the audience? Or no, I think we're nearing the end. I think on behalf of myself and I think the WPA team, thank you to everyone involved in making this what's been, I found, a really interesting discussion, especially to Councillor Green, to James with your research piece and our expert panel. It's been a real pleasure hosting you all. Thank you for your time. And thanks to everyone too who's joined the session. It's only a few hours to go, but in anticipation, I hope you all have a really lovely weekend. Thanks again very much, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.